Welcome to Mrs. Harmon's lecture on character development and study, what makes them tick. There's obviously so much more we can talk about with regard to character development. This is sort of a short and sweet version, and some of the material was adapted and original research was adapted from a document by Becky McDaniel. It's down there in the lower left-hand corner, and there's also a bibliography at the end of the lecture. All right, in this lecture, this is just a rundown of what you're going to talk about. We're going to touch on indirect and direct characterization. We're going to talk about a character analysis technique called S.O.D.A. We're going to address the emotional connection that we encounter with characters. We're going to talk about flat, round, static, and dynamic. We're going to look at the believability and what makes a character believable. We're going to look at minor and major characters. We're going to talk about some key questions, and we'll have some closing thoughts. So that's the rundown. That's pretty much the outline of this PowerPoint. All right, first of all, we need to talk a little bit about the relationship between character and plot. Character and plot are tied together, intrinsically tied together, because every character has to have some kind of a story to fit in, and every action requires actors. One thing I want to talk about real briefly here is the relatability of characters. We oftentimes think that in order for a character to be relatable to us, we have to have some things in common with that character, meaning, maybe we have similar backgrounds or we're of the same age. But that's not really necessarily the case. Sometimes just the relatability of a character can be the fact that we're all human, and we all have human characteristics, human failings, and situations that come up that are maybe not unique to each individual, but we have in common because we are all human beings. So keep that in mind when you think that you can't relate to a character because he or she is not your age or hasn't had a similar background that you have had. In fact, when we look at characters from a broader perspective, we realize that just like us, every character has a history. Every character has a birthplace, parents, residences, social status, educational level. We know about characters. The more round and developed a character is, the more we know about that character's history oftentimes. And like us, each character has a future. We oftentimes in our lives have moments of significance, big moments, and characters in literature and in stories also have those big focus moments, those moments of extreme significance. When we run into them in literature, they can lead characters to an epiphany, a revelation, to a bigger truth about themselves or the world around them or other people. And in literature, in stories, we will find that often those moments of significance can develop into or lead us to a theme. All right, how do we begin to look at characterization? Well, much like we do in real life when we deal with people, we gather information about other people based on a number of things, based on what they say to us, what they say to others, their actions, their traits and qualities, how they carry themselves. We start to visualize characters in literature by observing those things as well. In fact, Perrin labels the two basic forms of characterization as direct or indirect presentation. We will sometimes also say direct or indirect characterization. So let's start with the direct presentation or the direct characterization. And that occurs when the author tells us outright about the character through possibly exposition details. When you think about To Kill a Mockingbird, and Scout starts to narrate the story, and she said Macomb was a town, but it was a tired old town when I once knew it. And we start to kind of get an idea of the kind of person that she was and the child that she was at the time that the story occurred. The author will sometimes, or narrator, will sometimes give us an analysis of other characters, will provide us with narration, just simple storytelling, or even description about how characters look. And when you look at, again, the example of To Kill a Mockingbird, when Scout describes Dill and the way that he looked and the clothes that he was wearing, and that he said he was little, but he was old, and those descriptions coming from Scout actually will let us know more information about the character. Here's an example from Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey when the narrator is describing and presenting actually a little bit of an analysis of this character. She not only longed to be dancing, but was likewise aware that as the real dignity of her situation could not be known, she was sharing with the scores of other young ladies still sitting down. Through that analysis, that narration and that description, really all of those, we find out more about this character, that she has a sense of longing. She would like to be out there dancing, but that she was definitely paying attention to her surroundings and keeping her own dignity in check and taking stock of the other people with her as well. And that is all the narrator or the author giving us the information directly. Another way that an author can present a character through direct presentation is if someone else in the story tells us about the character or has a conversation, perhaps has comments with another character. This is an example from Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. And one character is telling another character about a third character who's named Katerina Ivanovna. And Katerina Ivanovna, though she is magnanimous, she is unjust, says this character. So when this character tells another character about Katerina, we then as readers are directly informed about some elements of her character. So those are the two examples of direct presentation. Now here are two examples of indirect presentation. With indirect presentation, we aren't explicitly told, but we implicitly have to infer what this character is like, what makes this character tick. And we do that through two main things, through words that we hear the character say, and through actions that we see the character perform. Indirect presentation is going to back up direct presentation. It's going to make the character more dramatic, more come to life, more realistic. The character, when we see that character in action, a lot of times we say actions speak louder than words, and if we see the character in action, we can really start to discern what type of character it is. Indirect presentation through words and actions can also create a stronger emotional connection with the character, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But this quote is a good example, I believe, of some drama and some emotion. It's from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and the quote is obviously from a frustrated, sort of exasperated person, and she's saying to another character, "Every minute, every instant that you have wasted on those books is utterly and entirely lost." And when we look at the diction there, we see the word wasted and utterly and entirely. And just from hearing the words of that character, you can feel the frustration, you can feel the angst, and you are able to make perhaps an emotional connection with what that character is going through at that particular moment in time. Well, I'm going to make it a little bit easier on you. This is a very well-known acronym. It is called S.O.D.A. And S.O.D.A is a way for us to sort of apply a systematic character analysis that takes into account direct and indirect characterization both. So this is kind of a short and sweet way of doing what we talked about in the past two slides. All right, we use S.O.D.A for analyzing character. So we're going to begin with the S in S.O.D.A, and the S in S.O.D.A is what the character says, what we actually just read in the previous slide. And again, that is indirect characterization. We listen to what a character says in dialogue, and we make a value judgment. We infer information about that character. What others say about the character is also important. That is the O. And that is more direct, and that was our example of Katerina Ivanovna. That was direct characterization, where one character is directly relaying what another character is like. The D is description, and it's also direct characterization, and often that's going to come from narration, from the author or a narrator describing a character, again, directly giving us information. The last one, A, as you can probably guess, is action. And action is what the character does. Again, indirect, because we are watching a character's behavior and then making inferences or value judgments about that person, that character. So S.O.D.A, what the character says, what others say, a description, and action. Once we're able to make a stronger case for analyzing character, we might be able to make a stronger emotional investment with a character. And that's very vital in many cases to the success of a story. Now, I want to be clear about emotional investment. Emotional investment does not mean you have to like a character. It means that there are emotions that you have regarding that character that are important. And when you look at perhaps a story like The Stranger by Albert Camus and the story of Meursault, Meursault is not a likable guy. He's on trial for murder. He's possibly going to get the death penalty. And yet, many people are emotionally invested with Meursault because they're so frustrated. They don't understand why he isn't doing the right thing. Some people are angry at Meursault because of his behavior. And so there are very few people who don't have some kind of an emotional feeling toward Meursault, albeit it might be bad or negative. Emotional investments, especially in a positive vein, allow for us actually to live vicariously through other characters. We're able to vicariously experience perhaps things that we wouldn't normally be able to experience, like going dragon hunting, or riding a boat through the underworld, or any number of kind of experiences that are either otherworldly or definitely outside the realm of our possibility. And we can, through characters, experience some of those things. We also, through characters, if we are able to make that emotional connection, are able to really get in touch with empathy. And to me, this is kind of one of the really cool benefits of reading a good character, is being able to really kind of get in touch with that character's pain or joy or grief or happiness or disappointment or any of those things without actually having the consequences of the experience itself. I mean, we've all read a book where we've been touched and we've cried and we've really felt what that character is feeling. But the good news is we aren't that character. At the end of the day, we can close the book and go on with our lives. So it's a great way for us to kind of safely experience emotions and work some things out too. All right, we're going to move on to the part of the lecture where we talk about character types, and you have been exposed to these before, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. I'll go fairly quickly. We have flat and round characters first, so we're going to talk about them. A flat character is often built around a single idea or a single quality. There's not much detail to individualize that character, to make that character be anything more dimensional than flat. And usually a flat character we can describe a flat character in a single phrase or a single sentence. And I think of To Kill a Mockingbird again with, say, Little Chuck Little in the classroom, or Miss Caroline in the classroom, Scout's class. And both of those characters are relatively flat. I mean, we could say Little Chuck Little was a polite little Southern boy who wanted to take care of his teacher. There you go, single phrase. Lays it out for you. He doesn't do much more. Miss Caroline is an optimistic woman from northern Alabama who wants to educate these little country bumpkins in Maycomb, Alabama. Boom. Done. Not much more to do. All right. They usually play minor roles, as both of those characters did, but they're not necessarily inferior characters. They could definitely, they could definitely help to drive the plot or the movement of the theme, but they're definitely not very multidimensional. Round characters, however, are multidimensional. They are much more complex in their behavior. They're complex in what makes them tick and their motivation. And as Abram says, they're represented with subtle particularity. Sometimes it's interesting to watch how they grow and develop. And Prine says they can be surprising with their depth and that they are many-sided. Those are flat and round characters. All right, now the next two types of characters we're going to look at are static and dynamic. Now, static characters don't change. So if you have a hard time remembering that, they stay the same. They are static and they stay the same. They're the same person at the beginning of the story that they are at the end of the story. So if we look like, let's look at To Kill a Mockingbird again, and we look at the character of Mr. Yule. He's definitely the same person at the end of the story that he is in the beginning. He's mean and he's ornery and he's scary, and he remains that way the entire novel. There's no change there. Dynamic characters, however, do change. They can change in a variety of ways. One aspect of their character can change, whole personality can change, outlook can change. The change can be important or basic, large or small, or for better or for worse. And most importantly, dynamic characters their change can be a clue to the story's meaning, or, as we like to say, the theme. So watch for character growth and development, especially with those dynamic characters. Well, believability is really vital to the work itself. It's really vital to the success of a piece of literature, to the movability of the theme. Characters just simply need to be believable. And there are three main ways that we can three main techniques, that we can kind of apply to determining the believability of a character. The first one is consistency. Is their behavior consistent all the way throughout? And unless there's a really good reason for them to change, we're going to expect some consistency. With Scout Finch, we know that she's naive, yet she's inquisitive and she's smart. And if throughout the course of the novel, that seems to fall apart, and she starts really acting out of character, doing things that she wouldn't maybe normally do. Maybe if she all of a sudden put on a dress and started wanting to hang out with the women full time, we would go, why did she do that? What was the reason? Because we know she's a tomboy, and she's probably going to continue to be consistently a tomboy throughout the story, unless there's a good reason for her to change. Characters need to be believable. We can look at that through motivation. There has to be clear goals and desires throughout the story for these characters. And so we need to believe that if something does hold the character back, that it will be cleared out towards the end of the novel. So motivation is incredibly important to understanding the believability. Why does the character do what he or she does? Is he or she adequately motivated? And lastly, plausibility. We really need to understand that we can't expect all good or all bad behavior from characters, because if we did, they wouldn't be human. If we expected them to be all good or all bad, then we're looking really at caricatures or cartoon figures rather than stories about people that we can believe in. So it'd have to be something that we could maybe see in real life, or someone that we could really believe would behave in a certain way in real life. So the three main ways to make characters believable are by examining consistency, motivation, and plausibility. Okay, when it comes to dynamic characters, the following elements must be in place in order for us to believe. Now, a dynamic character, again, is a character that changes. So, believability with dynamic characters has to do with, can we believe that this character can grow and change? Do we accept the movement or the growth in this character? We can do that in three ways. First of all, we have to look and see if the character demonstrates any possibility. Is there a particular change that we are expecting to see from this character, or that we can believe will happen with this particular character? Number 2 is situation. Will there be some situations in place that will change or sufficiently motivate the character to change? When I think about To Kill a Mockingbird again, Scout seems to demonstrates, the possibility of change because she's incredibly inquisitive, and she seems to be at a pivotal point in her life where a lot of things are changing around her, a lot of things are happening, and she's put in positions where she could probably grow, and she's always asking questions and trying to get the answers. So she demonstrates the possibility of change. And then the situation arises where she has this really pretty scary trial and also this neighbor who's kind of interesting, and there are some things that are motivating her to want to move forward as a character. And lastly, the change must take place over an appropriate amount of time. I mean, Scout Finch isn't all of a sudden going to walk up to Boo Radley's house on the 3rd page of the novel and say, okay, I'm ready to knock on the door and be buddies with this strange, malevolent phantom that they think lives there. And so it takes actually a lot more growth and maturity and experiences before we can accept that she's going to be able to have a conversation with Boo Radley, and indeed she does at the end of the novels. But an appropriate amount of time has to take place before we can accept that. When we look at round and dynamic characters, those are the kind of characters that are going to attract the reader's attention. And ultimately, and this is one of our main goals for round and dynamic characters especially, is allowing us to establish a level of psychological involvement. We talked about emotional involvement, now we're talking about psychological involvement. And that involves, as we said before, that sense, the ability to feel empathy and the ability to see characters as real people. This is kind of a favorite quote of Perrin's here. He says that fiction offers an unparalleled opportunity to observe human nature in all its complexity and multiplicity. It enables us to learn to know people, to understand them, and to learn compassion for them, as we might not otherwise do. In some respects, we can know fictional characters even better than we know real people. And I find that to be a really interesting statement. I know that we've all read novels where we've said, wow, I could, I just feel like I know that person, or I'm so in love with Mr. Darcy, or, any number of things that you've heard people say about characters in books that they've read. But I think what's more important there is that a lot of times we're able to see characters work out pretty intricate, be involved in pretty intricate and complex human situations and relationships. And it gets us thinking about how we would behave in situations similar to that, or with at least with similar emotions and feelings. And I think it helps us to become better people in the long run when we start to kind of internalize what some of the characters that we're reading about are going through. Let's talk about some major and minor characters. Clearly, we have some of the typical major characters we're used to seeing, the hero and the heroine, and the fact that they can be larger than life and almost godlike. And then we have, of course, the new brand of heroes today, the superheroes. But we also have, more specifically in most novels and stories, a protagonist. And a protagonist is simply the leading character of the story. It doesn't necessarily mean that the leading character is good or evil, but that character is definitely human and has human qualities, and it could be male, it could be female. But remember, a protagonist doesn't necessarily have to be virtuous. And then we have the anti-hero. Now that doesn't mean the bad guy. Anti-hero can be a leading character, but a leading character is a little bit more ordinary, a little bit more like we are, not really the hero. And he's called the hero, as Beatty and Hunter say, not because he opposes the hero, but because he's not like a hero in stature or in perfection. All right, and we have some other major characters. They can be major characters. We have the bad guy, the evil, the villain. We have the antagonist, and the antagonist is not necessarily the villain, but the antagonist goes against the protagonist and is generally involved in wanting to kind of stop whatever it is the protagonist is trying to accomplish. Another major character is a foil, and we're going to see that with Horatio and Hamlet when we read Hamlet later in the year. And it's a character who, as Abrams says, by sharp contrast, serves to stress and highlight the distinctive temperament of the protagonist. So if we put the protagonist and the foil next to each other, the foil somehow, by comparison, helps us to see and illuminates the protagonist even more. We have stock characters that can be major characters, and they can be sometimes stereotyped, but they're perhaps the strong silent sheriff, or the mad scientist, or the cruel stepmother. And stock characters can be, main characters can be involved in the story, but also stereotypical. Some minor characters with regard to that also can be frequently stereotypes, but not all of them are. A minor character, the way that you can tell, is it lacks depth, the depth of a rounded character. Minor characters are usually flat characters, but not all flat characters are, are not stereotypes. The usefulness of a minor character depends upon the function of the character in the story. For instance, you don't need to develop a character at all if that character is just going to be like the evil landlord, and that's just, that's it. There's no more depth or dimension around that person. You don't need to do any more developing, and that would be what makes a minor character. All right, I'm going to give you 4 questions to write down when evaluating fiction. It says the reader needs to be aware of how the various aspects of characterization contribute to the author's purpose. So these are some things that we've been talking about in the PowerPoint so far. What's the character's function or position in the story? Does the character change? That goes to that static or dynamic. If so, how and why? What motivates the character? And lastly, how does the character help communicate the theme of the story? And this is when we're talking about character-driven and theme-driven novels. We're going to be wanting to really pay attention to some of those key characters to see how they move the plot, they move the theme along, and get us to a big idea. All right, a closing thought, and we will be on our way. Ultimate characterization is just one way, even though it's an important one, that authors can communicate a story, can communicate a universal truth about mankind and the world around us. And certainly, if we pay attention to character, it can often lead us to a richer understanding both of the story and of the story's meaning. It can lead us to the theme. So he's going to take us on out. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.